Okay, everybody, welcome to week 4 content, Porter's Five Forces. So, the setup for this is that in the 80s, people, managers really, and academics in managerial economics really started putting into question the basic laws and kind of basic ideas that came from microeconomics, particularly related to, say, like market forces and perfect competition, and if monopolistic competition, all those things were very observable. So while we did discuss them early on, they do play a key role in starting to define kind of the level of competition within an industry. Porter comes along and says, okay, those are great and all, but there's got to be some underlying forces as to why those dynamics emerge. In which case, he started to look at some fundamental components of every industry. Now, Porter believes that you can describe any level of competition in any industry given these five forces. So it has been a fairly widely used tool in management programs, MBA programs, and has gained a lot of notoriety as an effective analysis to understand competitive dynamics for at like a very small level, say in a local economy, all the way up to a national economy. So basically, what Porter is trying to describe is that profitability is determined by the forces in every industry. In our market structure section, we said that profitability was determined by basically the number of players. In our history section, we started to say that profitability was determined by facts that have been set in place and have led to competitive advantage. And then you also started to look at competitive advantages as a source of profitability. Now, with that all in place, we start to think about a competitive analysis in terms of how it might change. And this is where the dynamism in our competitive analysis begins. So, in this section, we look at the industry. Next week, we look at the larger macro institutional environment. And then, lastly, in this analysis, we're going to say how firms responded. And that'll be basically dealing with issues of vertical integration, horizontal integration, and global expansion. Again, ways to insulate from these forces. So if we look at a couple of these key proposition here, basically what Porter is trying to say is that not only is competition shaped by these forces, but again, profitability. The stronger these forces are, basically the less likely the firm will face that competitive advantage in terms of excessive profits above industry standards. The weaker the forces are, the firm has insulated themselves and exists in more or less a bubble and maintains and enjoys rates of profitability that far exceed industry averages. So, what are the forces? Okay, they're not too crazy at first glance, and I think it is a very doable section, but it is a very important analysis because, again, what Porter and what our class is arguing is that these forces can be looked at in any business. So, for example, I mean, even at Rockhurst, when we start to think about the competitive dynamics of academics, MBA programs, nursing programs, and undergraduate programs, we look at these type of forces to say, where do we stand? At what level do we face some security, and what do we need to start thinking about in terms of possible changes? That does lead then to the potential to use a SWOT analysis, which I'm sure many of you in any early business class have looked at: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So, what are these forces? Well, Porter basically says that competition is shaped by rivalry, which would make sense. How intense players compete with each other, price factors, non price factors, entrance. So, is it easy or difficult to get into this industry? Again, if it was easy, eroding profits. If it was hard, creating stability and profits. Now, looking at the industry from a multiple industry perspective, what about suppliers? So, who are all the people that control the inputs to this industry? Are they in a monopolistic or oligopolistic structure and also then contributing to a deterioration of profits given their market power? Or have firms responded in many of these industries and vertically integrated and have bought the supply chain and now control even those levels of inputs to the production of the product or service. What about buyers? Are buyers captive to the product? Are buyers price sensitive? Are buyers perceive the good as a luxury product and hence will um, be able to and feel okay with paying higher prices? So what is their role? Now, don't always think again in this analysis that we're talking about consumer goods. Any industry could be analyzed with these five forces. So we could be talking about, the ball bearing industry as an output, and who would be the buyers of that, right? So we can look at any level of the industry and try to discuss what level of competition exists at that stage in the supply chain. Substitutes. This one's a bit tricky and we'll have to kind of work on it. We are not talking about rivalry. We are talking about goods that perform the same basic utility but are a different product or service in a different industry. So Porter argues that it is these five forces that describe all industries and then can give the person studying or the person in the industry a sense of how secure the industry is in terms of above average profits or not. Okay, so let's start to think about each of these sections. One thing that I have posted for you, it's in your Canvas, are a few clips of Porter himself. And I think you should take a look at them. It's always good to hear the first source. A lot of what I say will obviously be mirrored, but he goes and looks at a couple of industries that I think will help give you a sense of what's going on here. Also, your textbook. Some chapters have been useful, some are probably less useful. I'm sure you have experienced. This chapter is very important. Numerous examples are given of what a five forces analysis looks like. I've also included five forces from a previous paper that was submitted in a recent class. And don't forget that in the week one content or module one content, there is an entire paper that I think has a pretty good example of what a very well done five forces looks like. So go ahead and watch those clips when you get a chance. It might just help kind of crystallize whatever you get from this lecture, the book, and also your own thoughts. Okay, so again, kind of thinking about this as more of a dynamic framework. Yes, every econ class has to have boxes, arrows, and those arrows don't always have to be in one direction. Wow, that circle of arrows really does get at how dynamic things are in any industry. No, but in all jest, I think what it's trying to say in this very simple picture is that these factors, in fact, play back and forth with each other. So as changes occur in substitute suppliers, entrants, and buyers, heating up or not heating up rivalry, firms respond, and this changes the dynamics. And again, the analysis would have to begin again. So it's not a static model. It's definitely very dynamic. And something that good managers would want to evaluate on a frequent basis, depending upon the characteristics of the industry. So rapid change industry, pretty often. Very, very mature industry, possibly not. Okay, so here is kind of the basics of what you needed to know. So if you stopped here in the lecture, you would most likely be fine, but I do think that you should continue on to get a sense of what each of these forces implies, and then relating that back to the paper prompt so that you can actually create a good section. What are you trying to do here? First and foremost, do what you did in the first module. What is the product that you're actually producing? Okay. And now at this stage in the project, you should have started to get a pretty good sense of what it takes to make this thing or make this service. Okay, so you looked at the value chain, you started to research what the product is, you started to try to think about the product or service from a supplier's perspective, you mean the provider basically, rather than the consumer. So you're starting to get a better sense of what goes on to produce this thing. Good. That just means that you've looked at the upstream and the downstream channels. Inputs, outputs. So inputs, all the factors, materials, all the things that it took to build or create the service. And likewise, on the other side, distribution. And there are many factors there. We'll actually talk about a few of those in the next couple of weeks when we get to concepts like vertical integration. Okay, once you've identified this value chain or this supply chain, and you start to get a pretty good sense of how this product has actually been constructed, who's doing it? Okay, so you need to start to think about, are these firms doing this themselves? In other words, they are making all components of the production process, or are they using the market? Right. So you start to get a sense of, okay, do they deal with suppliers? How does the product get to distribution? Who is engaged in actually selling their product or service? Quick example: if you're doing a company like Apple, they don't really make their products, but they definitely are highly involved in the sale of their products and have their own stores and have everything basically down to the final detail of what it means to buy an Apple product. So they don't have necessarily a lot on the distribution side in terms of power, but on the other side, the Foxconn side of production of their goods and services, or their goods, definitely there's going to be some issues of supplier power. Okay, so who are these people? Now, asking this, you're trying to identify whether they're a threat or not. So you have to say, do these stakeholders, are they in a position where they are providing value and profit, or are they using their economic power to take away value and profit? And what you're trying to do is then find facts that then argue whether you feel these are correct or not, right? So you're trying to create a factual argument as to whether these stakeholders in each of these categories represents a threat to profits or actually presents an opportunity to profits. Okay, let's consider some of the components of here. What do we mean by rivalry? Well, this is actually firm interaction. So most of the groups that I've chosen for you are oligopolistic structures. And inherently, what that implies is that they're relatively large firms. They strategically compete, and they may compete on both price and non-price dimensions. So they could sometimes have sales, and this might lead to price wars. They sometimes might use slanderish details about each other to discourage buyers. Um, in not all countries is this the case. Sometimes that's illegal, but in the United States, there's a pretty big wiggle room for firms attacking each other. They might use differentiation through sponsorships. Okay, so these are kind of the competitive dynamics that these firms are having to utilize with each other, particularly in the case of an oligopolistic industry. So we're looking at, how do these firms actually respond to each other, knowing that if they're competing on price, engaging in a price war will cause an erosion of profits. What type of environment do you see price-based competition? That's typically with a lot of competition. So when the products are highly homogeneous, you start to see firms having to rely solely on the price of the good to attract market than, say, differentiating qualities. Most of the industries that you're in try to rely on product differentiation through marketing, product differentiation through value-added services, and product differentiation through commitment devices. So loyalty programs, rewards cards, memberships, those type of things, where again they're in fact causing you to spend more money with them as they keep you on and develop the perception that those are the firms where you get these goods or services. Okay, now clearly it's the case then that if they're having price competition, that's going to drive down profits. You could also see this non-price competition, but just as the price competition drives down revenues, non-price competition is going to drive up costs. So all of the things I just mentioned, all the rewards programs, membership programs, all those things cost money to the firm. And the goal is then to hopefully either while spending on those costs, allow the revenue to be greater than what it took to create any of those devices, commitment devices, and so forth. So the trick is internal rivalry is really what you're trying to identify here is, do the firms respond to each other? How likely are they to respond if one firm makes an action? How likely is Southwest to respond to moves by United or American Airlines? How likely are they to cut their prices if they see some type of movement from purchase of airline tickets in Southwest to purchase of airline tickets in United or American? Okay, so that could be an example of describing the level of rivalry. Okay. Kind of some general characteristics then. Where do we see this really high level of rivalry? We have a lot of them. We have a lot of firms. Some firms have maybe some type of competitive advantage that they've had withstanding. Could be learning curve issues, could be technological issues, where basically they have learned how to produce the product or service for cheaper. In industries where there is excess capacity, firms, remember, have to maintain some level of yearly output to meet forecasts and profit expectations. If they're public companies, definitely. If they're private companies, they may have internal shareholders and they may also have debt. They may also have debt that they need to service, in which case they need to sell their goods. So where are you going to see higher rivalry between firms? In industries where you start to see excess amounts of product or excess inventory. Think about how much cheaper electronics have become. There's excess capacity. Think about those times when it's expected that we'll see a pretty big increase in the sale of autos. There's a couple of years then after that, if it doesn't work, where cars get slashed on prices or they provide 0% financing for 5 years, essentially giving away free money to buy their vehicles. So excess capacity definitely is an issue because, again, what it means is there's too much of it. So what are we going to see? Firms will then have to compete with each other to sell it quicker. Undifferentiated products. So this could be, again, kind of similar to the idea of a homogenous products, but it's where a consumer can switch easily. They don't necessarily care so much about the nature of the good. They want the cheapest one. I always like to think of silly examples like, like toilet paper. There's definitely different grades, we all know, but in each grade, then there seems to be this wide distribution of price. Well, okay, it's pretty easy to switch from one to the next. What does the consumer really care about? They care about how much you're getting and how expensive it is. Another characteristic are markets where this information is widely accessible. So you can imagine how internet information and just retrieving different types of sales reports, or rather kind of like comparing prices, how much that's heated up rivalry between certain firms, where switching costs are easy, where information is widely spread, where you can find the same good immediately. Like, think about the ramification of Amazon. What do we do when we go buy anything? We always make sure that it's not cheaper on Amazon first, right? So you can see how intense that's caused the retail industry to have to respond. Now, where else could we see it? Where you can't change prices quickly. Basically, if there's kind of like very difficult way, it's very difficult to get out of this industry. Okay, so firms are kind of locked in. Then they have to rely on what they've done. So exit barriers, meaning like basically high fixed and high sunk costs, things they won't be able to cover. That industry is going to start to produce a higher sense of rivalry because they're stuck. They have to sell these goods or face extreme losses. So really what you're looking for here is, do you see competition between these firms? Do you see immediate rivalry presenting a major threat to profits, or has each firm in the group figured out a way to isolate themselves from each other? Okay. So kind of mentioning this a little bit earlier, how easy is it to get into this market? So this one's pretty fair. This is pretty straightforward, right? If it is easy to enter, you've just added another producer. Uh, Now, what this implies then is that you're just spreading out market share. If the potential for another seller selling a similar product that uh, is with low switching costs, that has characteristics that don't seemingly make any difference to the consumer, then you're going to erode profitability. You're going to erode market share for each firm, just de facto. So this one's very similar to the kind of initial discussion of market structures in Module 1. Okay, now what could cause more or less issues of entry? Okay, so where would you see, for example, no threat of entry? Well, something called the minimum efficient scale. So in industries that have extreme high levels of economies of scale, meaning that it takes a ton of output to produce a cost level that will result in profitability, you're going to see a barrier to entry. In industries where brand loyalty and goodwill is very strong, you're going to see a barrier to entry. In industries where historically the companies in the industry have dominated the supply chain to produce the product, you're going to see barriers to entry. And you also see things, I think that maybe this is one that might be out of your initial thoughts, when you start to see firms and industries that have exclusive contracts with government agencies. Again, will you be able to get that contract? It becomes increasingly difficult through time. The process to acquire those contracts is not easy. Okay. Now you do see another barrier in entry in terms of do you know how to sell the product? So while you may have the perfect good or service, actually getting it to market or having the ability, having marketability, basically, can also act as a barrier to entry. These could all be on the other side, right? You need to look at this from either is it causing more stress or is it not causing stress? Now, also thinking about is it easy for firms to come back in once they've left? Okay, so you're really trying to get at what does it take to enter this industry? Restaurants, very easy to get into at certain levels. Steel mills, energy production, coal mining, mineral mining, things that rely on utilities. Now, in the case of, say, like cell phone service, television, all these things, very difficult to get into. The just the basic framework of what it takes to achieve a level of profitability in those sectors is massive and almost impossible to think that someone could get in. It would take millions and millions of dollars, if not more. All right, now the tricky one. All right, entry makes pretty much good sense. Rivalry, firms responding to each other. What is a substitute? Okay, what you need to do is identify as close as you can what is the root of your good or service. Okay, and then start to think how can a buyer achieve the same benefit from something else in a different industry? Okay, that is a substitute. What it is it basically another industry attracting buyers from your industry to theirs. So if you are selling some type of food product, that is a specific type of food product, where else might those buyers likely to be to go? And how easily do they go there? Do they entertain both markets at the same time? Could be. So substitutes are, again, something that provides the same benefit somewhere else. Classic example. What do you get from riding a roller coaster? Right? You could say fun, so forth, but really it is thrill. You're really trying to get some type of adrenaline boost. Think now about all the other ways you can get adrenaline boost. Now think about who sells roller coasters. We now have identified substitutes to that entertainment district or that entertainment industry. So if I can get the same sense of skydiving from iFly, I now have realized, in fact, I do have two substitutes. They are different products servicing the same fundamental basic need or want, adrenaline. Okay. Now, while substitutes can erode profitability, complements can boost them. So you need to be thinking what it could be a complement of your strategic group's product. When you start to think like things like hotel, right? Hotels have so many. The whole nature of their business is complements. So it's not just that you stay there; it's that you eat there, it's that you swim there, exercise there, shop there, do business there, have conferences there, get all the entertainment you need there, right? Everything is a complement, and they do that on purpose because the initial product itself is basically nothing. It's a room with a bed, no matter how fancy it is. Their whole business is compliments. Okay, so it's a positive thing. Now, what you again then would have to argue is, are those compliments kind of competitive par? All firms have to do it, or do any of them represent competitive advantage to this group, to any individual firm? Something that we haven't covered, or maybe you haven't thought about, is price elasticity. Basic concept from Principles of Micro. But really, what it gets down to is just how sensitive are buyers. So, if buyers perceive substitutes as just as good, then we're going to see a price elasticity that's quite high. Meaning, if they see a drop in the price of a substitute and they switch, we know that your product isn't really all that special. So, trying to look at basically kind of consumer demand here and trying to get a sense of how loyal are buyers to this good versus substitutes. Okay, I think I have a bit more here. Okay, we've talked about now, let's see, entry, rivalry, substitutes and complements. Okay, what about upstream? The supplier power. Okay, so this is really where you have to kind of get intimate with the nature of your product. Um, does your company own the supply chain, or do they use a common supply chain? And who are those firms? Are there many of those firms? Are they historically in a economics power position? Um, how large are they? Do they have a pretty tight industry in terms of above average profits? If they do, you're starting to basically suggest that suppliers have quite a bit of power. They can hold up your profits. They can bargain down your profits. And this will lead you to, in the future of this paper, starting to think about, well, that's when firms start to buy up their supply chain and vertically integrate. Okay, so what kind of characteristics would be can kind of have some supplier power? Concentrated industry upstream, locked in relationships. So sometimes firms will engage in 5, 10 year contracts. Think about the actual, not airline industry, but the airplane manufacturing industry. Boeing, Airbus, they have 25-year contracts for the production of new fleets for all of the airlines. Here's the deal. If any of those airlines go up, guess what? There's going to be a new one who replaces them and who's going to buy those planes. So they have a lot more power in the industry than you would imagine. In fact, it's the suppliers of the airplanes that erode most of the profitability of the airline industry. You'll get a little bit of sense of that when you watch Michael Porter in one of those clips that I posted for you. Okay, so now, don't kind of, we have to start to think about this industry, all of these industries, not just always as like the final consumer product, but we just really want to make you kind of start to see that there are industries that provide inputs and there are industries that sell the outputs. So try not to get confused by the two, because clearly the firms in the industry that sells the output will be the buyers at one stage, and that will be a different force in itself. Okay, so what kind of factors would you look at when you're starting to research what supplier power would look like? You're basically doing another five forces, just in the upstream. You're doing a five forces at the level of the providers of the inputs. So kind of analyzing, okay, what goes on to get the things that are needed to make the product or service? How tight is that industry? That'll give you a pretty good sense of whether they have power or not. If upstream there are thousands and thousands of potential suppliers to produce the products that you need to make yours, you're going to tell pretty quickly that you have the power as a buyer, right, of those inputs. So, start to try to evaluate, what does it look like for the providers of the inputs? And that'll make this designation pretty clear as to whether supplier power is a threat or is a potential benefit. Okay, now buyers. Well, first you have to identify, are they the final buyer or are they an intermediate buyer? Um, are the products that your firms produce being consumed and then that's the end of the cycle, or are they being consumed in a way that's repurposing them or incorporating them and then sold to another channel? Okay, so that's going to start to give you a sense of buyer power. Don't immediately think like the mall or a Target or a Walmart, right? That's kind of where our minds immediately go because that's our everyday life. But that is definitely not the case. We have to think. You have to start to identify and say, who actually buys my product, and then you can start to assess whether there's buyer power or not. What you're looking for here is how the buyer perceives your product. So this is where it kind of ties all in. If your product is homogenous, then clearly the buyer is going to have the ability to switch. They can bargain away some type of pricing power and hence profitability. They can look for alternatives. They can shop around. They can look for the best deal. If they have good information, all the kind of same things we were talking about, which would heat up rivalry, well, of course, is going to relate to who's actually buying the product. Okay, so putting it all together, here's kind of a nice little summary here. And what I need you to do then is to start to construct each section, looking for about 1.5, 2 pages per section. Again, a minimum of 3 sources per section. So trying to have some pretty good documentation of your arguments and also how you put those arguments together. After you've completed each section, what I'd like you to do then is create kind of a summary statement and to say, okay, now I've identified the 5 forces. What does it seem like the group or the firms have done in this group to start to kind of deal with these forces? Do you see any actions that have been recently taken? And this will help start you. This will help you to start thinking about the conclusion of your paper as to where to go next. Okay, so what do we really get from thinking about the 5 forces? Okay, well, what we've done is gone beyond the simple framework of just a regular kind of perfect competition, monopolistic competition, market structure analysis. We've also realized that while it may seem obvious now, that not all industries have the same potential profitability, and not all firms in the industry have the same profitability. What we're trying to do is assess these forces and determine whether they represent some type of opportunity or some type of threat. And then where are you going to position yourself? How are you going to differentiate yourself, and how are you going to potentially